This is my analysis of Mowing by Robert Frost. First of all, let's go through what this poem is about. It follows a farmer who is cutting grass with a scythe, which makes a hissing noise. He imagines that the scythe is whispering to the ground, and he wonders what it's talking about. He thinks it isn't talking about rest or reward. Instead, it's focused on the job at hand, getting satisfaction from its labour and the truth of the real world. The farmer is inspired by this to stop dreaming about the whispers and focus on his work too. This poem is written in a sonnet form, and it's split into an octave, the first 8 lines, and a sestet, the last 6 lines. And we are going to be going over the form a little bit more later on, but the reason I bring this up now is because it made the most sense to me to split my line by line analysis into first the octave and then the sestet. There was never a sound beside the wood but one, and that was my long scythe whispering to the ground. What was it whispered? I knew not well myself. Perhaps it was something about the heat of the sun, something perhaps about the lack of sound, and that was why it whispered and did not speak. It was no dream of the gift of idle hours, or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. The use of the word sound in the first sentence immediately engages our ears, and the next line effectively gets across what this sound is, because whispering is onomatopoeia, and there is an alliteration of the sound S. The swaying motion of the scythe moving back and forth is portrayed in the repetition and the rhythm of the lines 4 and 5, and these are a good example of Frost's sound of sense approach to writing poetry. So to quickly define this means understanding words in terms of not just their meaning, but their musicality or their rhythm. So he often used the rhythm of human speech to guide his poems. Of course, a very noteworthy thing in these lines is the personification of the scythe, and the purpose of this is so it can be compared with the farmer like it's a colleague. There being no other sound in the wood represents the scythe's single focus on its job. Lines 4 to 5 also have a double meaning. So my interpretation of their meaning is that this is the narrator theorizing what the scythe is whispering. So he's thinking maybe it's talking about the heat of the sun, maybe it's talking about how there's no sound around. But then this also lets us in on his situation. He's subconsciously describing his own thoughts. So he's thinking, perhaps I have heat stroke, perhaps that's what's making me think this, or perhaps I'm just trying to fill the silence. And in lines 7 to 8, the narrator describes how he doesn't think the scythe is whispering about rest or reward like people would when doing a hard job. Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak to the earnest love that laid the swale in rows, not without feeble-pointed spikes of flowers, pale orchises, and scared a bright green snake. The fact is the sweetest dream that labour knows. My long scythe whispered, and left the hay to make. Line 9 strikingly announces that truth is far more beautiful than things made up in the imagination. And so, instead of dreaming of something better, the scythe takes satisfaction or earnest love from its hard work, the fact, and its pleasure in this outweighs even the sweetest dream. This morally right, in the context of the poem, viewpoint, is emphasized through the first end-stopped line, that's line 13, with its omniscient firm tone and beautiful diction. To explain what a couple of the words in this part of the poem mean, swale is a low-lying tract of land, and orchis is a breed of orchid with spiky petals. Then if we look at line 14, the poem ends in a circular manner. The farmer stops analysing the whispers of the scythe and focusing on his imagination, and he goes back to the literal description of the scythe. And inspired by this view of the scythe, he gets on with his simple, honest work like it is doing. Okay, now let's get into the form of the poem. As I said before, this is a sonnet, but it's not in the traditional Shakespearean or Petrarchan form. Rather, it's a mix of the two. Frost makes his own version, which I think is appropriate to the subject matter of the poem because, unlike most sonnets, it's not about lofty, dramatic, or fantastical themes. Instead, it focuses on humble, real life. It's also split into an octave and a sestet, and the reason I think the division between these is so clear is because the octave focuses on abstract concepts such as heat and silence, as well as imaginary things such as elves and fae, whereas the sestet focuses on fact, such as truth and labour, and concrete ideas, such as the snake, the flowers, and the hay. Another thing to point out is that there are no similes or metaphors, except perhaps the extended metaphor of the scythe, and there is very simple diction for most of the poem, e.g. heat, whispering, scared. You would think that a professional poet could come up with some more poetic lines, to be honest, but I think that this was again done on purpose, and it goes with the humble and realistic theme of the poem. The literary devices used include onomatopoeia of whispering and alliteration of s, and both of these portray the sound of the scythe swishing. The repetition and rhythm in lines 4 to 5 portray the swaying motion of the scythe. There is also personification of the scythe, so the farmer can directly compare his work ethic to it, like a colleague. It can also be seen as an extended metaphor for hard work and labour, and I think this really works well because a scythe is a tool for labour and it's sharp and tough, which portrays, the hard aspect of doing labour. And it also represents the right approach to doing hard work and labour, because a scythe is a very effective tool and it just gets on with its job. The double meaning of lines 4 and 5 effectively portray both what the narrator is imagining and his actual situation. I think that especially is very clever. Then there is end-stopped lines at the end of the poem, which have an omniscient and firm tone, which emphasize the morally right viewpoint of the scythe towards labour. Speaking of, I think that the moral of this poem is that beauty is to be found in truth and in the real world, not in lofty imaginings. And labour and hard work is a way of reconnecting with that truth. So to put these a little more in the context of the story can be seen as a problem, which is the scythe's whispering is inaudible, and a solution, which is that the whispering is unimportant. It doesn't matter what the scythe is saying. Thus, the farmer is inspired by his scythe to see the value in work and the happiness that can be found in real life, rather than in his imagination. Imagination is not discounted, for it was through imagination that he came to this revelation, by imagining what the scythe was saying. This is similar to another Frost poem, Birches, and its message of Earth, or the real world, being the right place for love, but imagination being a means of making it more bearable. Now let's talk about the scythe a little more, the biggest symbol for the moral of this poem. So a scythe is a metal tool with a sharp blade at the end, and that makes it the perfect symbol for unromantic labour and harsh reality. Presenting this through farming and this sharp tool allows him to not discredit the harsh aspects of living in reality. He never presents living in the real world and just getting on with your labour as an easy thing to do. And the way that he alludes to this part of reality, the harsh side, is through farming and how it is creation through destruction. So the scythe's earnest love creates destruction. It cuts flowers and it scares snakes. Yet the scythe's point of view is still presented as the morally right one in the poem. Finally, I'm going to talk about a possible interpretation of this poem, which is that it could be talking about the right approach to writing poetry. So the line, anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak, could be a reference to poetry and how it should describe beauty in the real world, which is sufficient and needn't be added to with imaginings. Frost was quite controversial for writing about humble farm life, when most poets would write about epic battles and fairy tales and myths and things. And maybe he's saying, look guys, there's enough beauty in the real world and everyday life. We don't need to be writing about this stuff that never even happened. The ending and how the scythe left the hay to make could be referring also to how, after a certain point in the creative process, the creation is no longer in the hands of the creator. And a good example of this is this analysis I'm doing right now, because I could be drawing all this meaning from this poem that Robert Frost, when he wrote it, never intended. But that's okay, because the poem is an open resource now. It doesn't belong to anyone, including him. It's something that everyone can get their own interpretation from and their own meaning. So Frost may have been telling other poets to be more down to earth about their poetry and look at the creative process from a realistic point of view, to maybe relax more about being so preachy or trying to convey some higher meaning, and instead just narrate events and present ideas and leave it to the reader to create their own interpretation. Thus, this really simple, short poem can have a lot of meaning for us as readers of Robert Frost's poetry. So I hope you enjoyed going through it with me. Swale is a low-lying tract of land, and orchis is a breed of orchid with spiky tails.